They sat me behind a second cousin I barely knew families up front, the usher said, eyes fixed on the hymn book. Name's Merritt Hayes, 51. Navy logistics retired, apparently invisible. Smell of starch clung to my old uniform. The tie Dad gave me stayed folded in my pocket. Ever been honored after being erased? I was halfway through folding my pressed white shirt when the phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text from Mom. "Don't wear that old tie, Merritt. It looks cheap." I didn't answer right away. The motel light flickered slightly, the kind of tired pulse that only chain motels manage to perfect. I set the phone down next to the stiff collar of my shirt and looked at the tie draped across the bedspread. Silver-gray silk, a little frayed along the edge, the knot crease softened from years of respectful wear. It had been a gift from Dad. He never said, "I'm proud of you." That wasn't his way. He simply handed me the box outside the recruit processing office in Pensacola and said, "Take care of it." The box still held a faint scent of cedar, and something sharper, maybe the cologne he wore back then, the one I never saw again after he switched to something subtler in retirement. I reached for the tie and folded it carefully. The silk resisted slightly, as if it too remembered the shape of that first knot tied in a mirror where my hands trembled and my father stood just behind the door waiting. Not helping, just waiting. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the uneven click of the ice machine outside. I packed the tie, last tucking it in beside a framed family photo wrapped in one of my clean socks. In it, we all smiled, me, Mom, Grady, and Dad, but I remembered the day clearly. We'd argued right after it was taken. Something about the Navy again. Or maybe the budget. Or maybe just the way I kept missing birthdays. The details blurred. The feeling stayed. By 6:20 a.m., I was on the road heading north to Rockland. The Chesapeake fog thinned as I crossed into Maryland, then thickened again near Trenton. I kept the radio off. Audiobooks sat queued on the dash, untouched. I drove in silence, stopping only once to refill coffee and adjust the side mirror that had been rattling since Richmond. Somewhere past Portsmouth, I replayed a memory I hadn't invited, the way Dad stood at the edge of the Navy Pier during my first homecoming, squinting into the sun. He didn't wave, just stood there with both hands behind his back like he was reviewing a ship. I arrived in Rockland just after dusk. The harbor lights were soft and steady, their reflections stretching like long fingers over the cold Atlantic water. I pulled into the same motel we'd stayed at for Grady's graduation, a beige 2-story place with peeling paint and a Coke machine that swallowed your money half the time. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That was fine. I wasn't sure I recognized myself either. Room 209 faced the parking lot. A blinking street lamp cast pale orange streaks across the ceiling. I unpacked slowly, lining up shirt slacks, socks. I saved the tie for last. Again. I took it out, unfolded it carefully, and let it rest in my hands. The fray on the edge was worse than I remembered. I ran a thumb along the seam. Dad's voice came back, not a sentence, just the gravelly tone he used when he was about to say something important, and then didn't. Maybe that was our whole relationship. Almost said things. I stood there holding the tie until my arms ached, and then deliberately I folded it again and slid it into the inner pocket of my overcoat. Not around my neck. Not in the trash. Not yet. Somehow that small choice felt heavier than the drive. Outside, the night air bit clean and sharp. I pulled the door shut behind me, the latch clicking too loud in the stillness. The street lamp buzzed. I adjusted my coat collar, slid my hands into my pockets, and looked up at the thin thread of stars above the harbor. "Let's see if I still belong at my father's farewell," I said aloud, to no one in particular. Maybe to him. They seated me behind the second cousin from Connecticut, someone I barely remembered from a fishing trip 20 years ago. The usher didn't meet my eyes when he said families up front. He gestured vaguely to the front pews now filling with familiar faces in better suits than mine. I nodded, said nothing, and took my assigned place in the third row. The church smelled of old stone candle wax and wet wool. A cold April wind had followed us in, leaving damp footprints across the slate floor. Coats dripped quietly on the backs of pews. The stained glass windows let in weak gray light, as if the sky itself wasn't quite sure this was worth a full show. From where I sat, I could see the front rows clearly. My mother sat rigid, her shoulders squared and her scarf pinned just so. Grady stood beside her, speaking in low tones to the pastor. He looked polished, his suit sharp hair trimmed just past military regulation, like he'd borrowed dignity for the day. Around them I spotted Dad's law partner, the mayor and the bank manager, who still sent me annual birthday cards out of habit. I adjusted the crease on my pants and focused on breathing through my nose. Calm, controlled. The organ gave a soft moan, and the service began. Pastor Coates welcomed the gathering with the ease of a man who'd buried generations. His voice was warm, unobtrusive. He spoke of a life of service, a man of duty, and a father deeply loved. Then Grady stood. He began his eulogy with a story from their annual father-son fishing trips. The crowd chuckled in the right places. He told of Dad's moral compass, his devotion to the town, his love for our mother. He even mentioned how Dad never missed a town hall meeting, how he insisted on punctuality as a virtue. He did not mention Guam. He did not mention my commissioning ceremony. He did not mention me. I watched Mildred nod at every line, her eyes dry, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked like she was listening to an old hymn, predictable, well-practiced, devoid of surprises. Then came the slideshow. A projector whirred quietly as images blinked to life on the wall behind the altar. Dad in his navy blues. Dad shaking hands with local officials. Dad and Grady on a boat holding up a silver-striped bass. Dad and Grady at the 4th of July parade. Then came a photo I knew well, the whole family at my OCS graduation. But on this screen only half my face showed, cropped awkwardly as if I'd leaned into a stranger's picture. No name in the caption, no mention of what the day meant. Click. The image shifted. Click. Grady at the Rotary Club. Click. Grady with Dad and Mom at Thanksgiving. A woman 2 rows behind leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Didn't he used to be in the Coast Guard or something?" The other shrugged. I kept my eyes on the altar. My hands were folded, knuckles pale. Inside the breast pocket of my coat, I felt the folded tie. Still cold from the drive, still holding its shape. I didn't reach for it. I just let it rest there against my chest like a small, forgotten medal. The service ended with a soft amen. People stood. Coats rustled. The organ hummed again, a slow, respectful dirge. As they filed past me, a few offered polite nods. One woman clasped my forearm and said, "He was a great man." I smiled, said, "Thank you," and let her pass. Outside, the clouds had thickened. The wind scraped along the stone wall of the church like it was looking for something. I stood under the awning for a moment, watching the cars pull out. Then I stepped down the stone steps, hand brushing the railing. Somewhere behind me, Grady laughed softly at something the mayor said. I didn't turn around. I once saw your father cry, came the voice from behind, low and unmistakable, just outside the church hall. It was over you, not Grady. I turned slowly. Arthur Leland stood under the narrow overhang, balancing his cane against one wrought iron chair and motioning with the other hand toward the empty seat across from him. I didn't know he still had tear ducts, I said, trying for lightness. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Arthur chuckled. They weren't dramatic tears, no tissue, just a blink too long, a turn of the head. It was the morning after you shipped out for Guam. He'd just finished washing his coffee cup, and he didn't say a word for 15 minutes. The patio was quiet, a slice of gray light slanting across the slate floor. 2 mugs sat abandoned on the table, lukewarm coffee, with grease rings circling the lip like small halos. Arthur nudged one toward me. He told me once, Arthur continued, that he never got the hang of goodbyes, that you didn't either. I sat down slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the mug, not drinking. I hadn't seen Arthur in years. He'd aged, sure, thinner hair, more lines, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. He always had a way of letting silence do the work. You still walking 3 miles every morning? I asked, trying to shift. He snorted. I walk to the mailbox. Some mornings I even bring the mail back in. I smiled. The breeze picked up, stirring the corners of the funeral program folded in my coat pocket. We sat like that for a minute's silence, again settling between us. Then Arthur reached into his inside jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. I debated bringing this, but your father wrote it the day you left. He asked me to hold on to it. I don't know if he meant forever, or just until he found the words to say it himself. He laid the envelope on the table. My name, Merritt, was written in all caps with a slight rightward slant. Dad's handwriting, immediate, precise, no return address, no date, just the name. I didn't move to take it. Arthur stood steadying himself with the cane. I'm heading to Lou's for lunch. You can come or sit here feeling like you've been forgotten. Either way, I'm ordering fries. He didn't wait for my reply, just turned and limped down the walkway. I picked up the envelope, turned it over twice, and slipped it into my jacket. As I followed, my fingers brushed the folded tie in the inner pocket. Still there. Still cold. Lou's diner hadn't changed since high school. Same cracked vinyl booths, same faded menu board above the counter, same woman at the register chewing gum like it owed her something. Arthur slid into a booth and waved for 2 coffees. I sat across from him, the letter burning a hole in my chest. Bathroom's in the back, he said, not looking at me. You'll want privacy. I hesitated, then stood. The restroom smelled of antiseptic and damp towels. I locked the door behind me and unfolded the letter slowly. It had been folded twice lengthwise, then again across, just like he used to do with his grocery lists. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The ink had smudged slightly, as if his hand had paused too long. The handwriting wasn't quite as rigid as I remembered. Merritt, I don't know how to say this in person. Maybe that's cowardice. Maybe it's just age. You're braver than I ever was. I didn't know how to show pride without turning it into instruction. I didn't know how to say I missed you without making it sound like guilt. I hope Guam treats you with the same decency you've always shown your family, even when we didn't return it. You'll always be my son. Preston. The word son was underlined. Not once, but twice. Heavy. I folded the letter again carefully and stared at the mirror for a moment. My reflection looked unchanged. Maybe a little older. Maybe not. When I came back out, Arthur was stirring cream into his coffee. He didn't look up. "I've known that man 40 years, he said, "and I never once saw him write anything by hand unless it was legal." I nodded, slid into the booth. The envelope rested quietly inside my coat next to the tie. Arthur sipped. Then he asked, "Will, you speak tomorrow? Not for them, but for him? You're not going to make this about you?" Grady snapped. Voice tight, knuckles white around a Starbucks cup. "Not today." We were in the church prep room, a boxy space off the side hallway, lined with stacked chairs and forgotten choir robes. The fluorescent light above us buzzed faintly, casting a greenish tint over everything. It flickered just enough to make the silence feel more awkward, more deliberate. I didn't answer. The tie rested in my palm, folded, edges frayed. I had taken it out a minute ago, more out of habit than intention, just to hold it, just to remember. Grady saw it and snapped like dry wood. He crossed the room in 3 strides, the scent of his cologne overtaking the faint must of the carpet. "You seriously brought that?" he hissed. To this I raised my eyebrows, kept my voice level. It was his. "No," Grady said, pointing with the cup. "It was yours. He gave it to you." "Yeah, but that doesn't mean—" He trailed off, glancing at the closed door as if someone might be listening. "We've worked hard to make this clean, Merritt. Legacy, image, whatever you want to call it. You showing up with this, with that letter, it muddies things." I tucked the tie halfway into my coat pocket. "You mean it complicates the version of him you're selling?" Grady let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You always talk like that. Like you're above all this. You weren't here the past decade. You missed the slow part, the breakdowns, the nights he didn't come home until morning, because he was walking laps around the lake in the dark. The meds, the hiding." I said nothing. I had no defense. He was right, I had missed all of that. I was in Guam, and then Virginia, and then nowhere, really. That tie, he went on pointing again, doesn't belong in front of a microphone today. You don't either. I held it in my palm, not answering. The silk caught the flicker of the light above us. Grady reached out fast and yanked it from my hand. The motion surprised me more than the anger behind it. The fabric made a faint ripping sound as his ring snagged the loose seam near the edge. He stared at it, realizing, then dropped it like something offensive. The tie hit the floor with a soft slap, landing in a dusty patch by the leg of a folding table. Grady stepped back. We both stood there for a second. "You know what Dad told me once," I said quietly. He said, "Don't argue with people who need to win. Just outlast them." Grady didn't respond. His tie, navy blue silk perfect, was knotted so precisely it looked like a catalog photo. I bent down, slowly picked up the silver-gray tie. I didn't shake the dust off. I didn't smooth it. I just folded it again, same way I had in Pensacola the first time he gave it to me. Tight, neat, deliberate. I slipped it back into the inside pocket of my coat. Mildred entered then, brief as a shadow. She took one look at the two of us at the silence at my hand, just leaving the coat. She didn't speak. Her eyes lingered for half a beat too long on the spot where the tie had been. Then she turned and left without a word. Grady exhaled hard, like air escaping from something overinflated. "You want to make this a scene?" he asked. "No," I said. I already have a part. You just don't see it. I stepped toward the hallway, pausing briefly as I reached the door. I wasn't sure why. Maybe habit, maybe hope. That's when I heard it. Arthur's voice low but firm from just beyond the ajar door. He earned that tie, he was saying to someone. Preston told me that much. I didn't wait to hear who he was talking to. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank subject line for a long minute. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, twitching once, twice. Then I began to type. Subject in honor of Preston Hayes' unsent truths. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, steady and accusatory. I took a slow sip from the styrofoam cup on the windowsill. The motel room smelled like burnt coffee and starch. Steam from the tiny machine coiled upward and fogged the corner of the glass pane. Outside, the tide had slipped away from the rocks, leaving seaweed draped like ribbons on the shore. It was 6:17 a.m., the kind of early that felt older than morning, when everything still carried the weight of yesterday. I attached the scan of Dad's handwritten letter, the one Arthur gave me, and then the audio clip from Guam. It was short, rough in quality, just background chatter and a few seconds of my father's voice asking about the pinning schedule. I remembered the moment. I hadn't known someone had caught it. The final attachment was a photo, low-resolution, grainy, but clear enough. Dad's hand raised in a salute as I stood at attention. His eyes weren't visible, shadowed under the brim, but the angle of his mouth suggested something between pride and disbelief. I sat back and read the email aloud, voice low in the small, quiet room. Dear Pastor Coates, I am writing not to disrupt, but to illuminate. In your program today, you honor a father, a friend, and a civic leader. I write as his son left out of that picture who carries a piece of his truth. Attached are fragments. They are not perfect. They are not tidy. But they are real. I do not seek a speech. I seek a name. With respect, Commander Merritt Hayes Rhett. I blinked twice, then added 2 more recipients, the Rockland Navy Alumni Group and Arthur Leland. Just before clicking send, I noticed an older email group auto-filled in the CC bar, Rockland Town Contacts. I hadn't used that distribution list since the Memorial Day ceremony in 2016. My cursor hovered. I didn't remove it. I clicked send. The screen flashed for a second. Then the draft disappeared. The room felt oddly louder afterward, as if the old HVAC unit had suddenly remembered its job and kicked on. I stood and walked over to the bed. My phone buzzed once. Arthur, you did it. His voice was low, steady. Yeah, you'll get pushback. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it'll come. I know. A pause. But you also know what's right. I do. We didn't say goodbye. Just the faint crackle of the line, and then silence. I paced for a while, checked the mirror. I looked like someone in between things, half in grief, half in mission mode. My dress shoes still sat in the corner, dusty from disuse. The uniform hung in the plastic cover untouched since my final base inspection. Then the ping. I turned to the screen. An email from Pastor Coates. Thank you for sharing, Commander Hayes. We are updating the program accordingly, and thank you for your service and for your courage. I exhaled more from habit than relief. The cursor blinked again in the corner of the email pane. I opened the closet and unzipped the garment bag. The uniform was still crisp, but the patch over the right breast pocket had begun to fray just a little, enough to notice. I ran my thumb over the stitches. Then I reached into the inside pocket of yesterday's coat and took out the tie. It was still folded, but the crease had loosened. A faint dust mark traced the edge from where it had fallen on the prep room carpet. I didn't wipe it away. I laid the uniform carefully across the bed, then placed the tie next to it, side by side. One threadbare one honored. Both mine. I hadn't even zipped my jacket when I heard it. Admiral on deck. It wasn't meant for me, I knew that, but it still struck like a rescue flare, sudden searing, impossible to ignore. The voice was sharp official, and for a heartbeat I straightened instinctively. The tribute was taking place on the side lawn of the Rockland Naval Museum. Not part of the official funeral service, more a satellite gesture set apart but dignified. A folding podium had been placed beneath a tall maple just beginning to bud. The sky was the kind of bright that hurt a little to look at directly, and the flags lined up behind the podium hung at half-mast, their fabric snapping lightly in the breeze like a whisper passed among old friends. I stood in full uniform now. First time in years. The jacket still fit, though it tugged slightly at the shoulders. The patch over my heart had been restitched, but the thread didn't match, and the tie, silver-gray, frayed at one edge, was tucked slightly off-center beneath the collar. I hadn't adjusted it. I didn't want to hide the imperfect parts. A few rows of folding chairs had been arranged. Not many attendees, just a few local veterans, some Navy alumni, and 2 museum docents who looked uncertain about whether they were supposed to be there. Arthur stood toward the back, his cane planted firmly on the grass, hands clasped in front like a reverend at a wedding. Then a man stepped forward, crisp uniform white cap tucked beneath his elbow. He moved with practiced grace and paused at the mic without checking his notes. Captain Jonathan Harris, he introduced himself, voice low but carrying. Department of the Navy. I didn't know Commander Preston Hayes personally, but I've read enough in the last 48 hours to wish I had. He looked out over the chairs, and somehow his gaze stopped on me without making it awkward. There are men, he said, whose service is visible, whose records appear in brochures, whose stories are repeated at recruiting offices. And there are men whose service is quieter, less narrated, no less noble. He held up a thin folder and opened it. The department recognizes Commander Preston Hayes for distinguished leadership and enduring legacy in naval mentorship. We further recognize Commander Merritt Hayes for continued commitment to honor and duty despite complexity. He paused, letting the word complexity settle into the silence. Then the screen flickered to life beside the podium. A shaky video clip labeled GUAM 2009 Final filled the canvas. It showed me younger, thinner eyes narrowed at something just out of frame. Then a cut. A hospital bed. My father looking older than I remembered, eyes sharp despite the IV. The sound was faint, but clear enough. My boy made me proud in ways I never said, never knew how. A still frame held the last image, his hand on the edge of the bed curled slightly as if reaching. Then it faded. Captain Harris turned and faced me fully. He stepped forward, saluted a sharp, deliberate gesture. I returned it, my hand just a half-second slower. Then he turned to the crowd. "Rockland doesn't erase service," he said. "It honors it." Silence followed, not empty, but respectful. The kind that weighs something. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Mildred walked forward, gloved hands at her sides. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe the setting made her seem so surrounded by flags and folded chairs, grief and formality. She didn't look at me, just bent slightly, placed a bouquet of white flowers at my feet. No wrapping, no card. Fresh. Cut that morning. Her hand trembled as she straightened. Not from weakness, just the weight of it all. Then, as she turned to leave, she said quietly, "He would have liked that." She didn't wait for a reply. And I didn't offer one. Arthur handed me the envelope just as the last chairs were being folded. "He wanted you to have this," he said, fingers curling gently around the edges after the final salute. I nodded, said nothing. The envelope was ivory thick, old-fashioned. Dad had always insisted on decent stationery, even for overdue bills. No return address, no name. I slipped it into my coat and didn't open it until I was back at the house. The library smelled like lemon oil and paper. Dust motes floated lazily in the shaft of light filtering through the west-facing window. It was the room Dad never truly modernized. Same curtains, same oak shelves, the same globe with the scratch across Guam that made me laugh as a teenager. I sat in the leather armchair, the one he used to favor, and opened the envelope with slow fingers. Inside was a single page. Typed. No salutation, no sign-off. Just a date, 2 weeks before he died. "You always were the better man." That's what I couldn't say. Maybe the uniform made it easier for me to be proud. Maybe the silence made it easier not to show it. I read it twice. Then again. There was no name at the bottom. But I didn't need one. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled down a worn cardboard box labeled Photos, Pre-Deployment. Inside, nestled among bent corners and old negatives, was a picture I hadn't seen in years. Dad in his Navy dress uniform, standing beside a younger me at the Guam ceremony. His face unreadable, my smile tentative. But there it was. The same tie. Silver gray. Faintly creased. The pattern more visible in the printed photo than in real life. It looked newer then, but it was unmistakable. I retrieved the broken walnut frame from the kitchen drawer. It had once held Grady's college diploma until the glass cracked and no one bothered to fix it. I removed the diploma, gently replaced it with the photo, then folded the tie carefully, reverently, and laid it flat beside the image. The corners of the backing were splintered. I reached for the only tool I had at hand, a roll of yellow duct tape from the garage, the kind we used to patch up bunks in field barracks. It crackled as I peeled it, the sound loud in the quiet room. I patched the corners slowly, sealing the back with precision only a military man or a careful son would bother with. The tie rested peacefully now, unknotted, unmarred. The crease still visible, but it seemed earned. I placed the frame on the lower shelf of the library below Dad's medals, but above the gardening books he never read. Arthur knocked gently on the doorframe but didn't enter. "That'll hold," he said, nodding at the duct tape. I offered a quiet smile. "It's not elegant, but it's true." Then Mildred appeared. No shoes, just woolen socks on polished wood. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the frame. Finally, almost too softly to hear, "It was never about Grady. Your father just didn't know how to show it." I turned to her, but she was already walking away. Later that night I sat at the dining table. The lawyer had emailed over the final paperwork. I signed it once, then again. Hayes Naval Fund, Scholarship Endowment for Families of Quiet Service. No speeches, no press release, just the click of the mouse and the gentle sound of legacy shifting. "Thank you for coming," I said into the microphone, the feedback soft, just enough to make the folding chairs creak. "This scholarship isn't for perfect sons. It's for quiet ones." The room wasn't fancy, just the Rockland Community Hall dressed up with trifold posters and tablecloths that didn't quite match. Flags lined the back wall and someone had taped blue stars to the windows. A long table along the left held pies of every kind, lemon meringue choufle, something purple and unnameable. But the faces were what mattered. Students with pressed shirts and nerves, parents some in worn denim, some in polished shoes. A few old veterans sat near the front one, nodding slowly as I spoke. His cap read USS Bunker Hill, 1968. I wasn't in uniform, just slacks and a button-down shirt. But I wore the tie restored, not flawless. The crease was still there, the edge still dusted, but it lay flat now and it belonged. I cleared my throat. When my father passed, I didn't think I'd speak today. Honestly, I didn't think anyone would want me to. But over the past few weeks, I've learned that legacy doesn't sit in pews or ride on nameplates. It shows up in smaller ways in tape that holds in letters left unsent in the silence between one salute and the next. I gestured toward a young girl in the third row. "Today we award our first Hayes Fund scholarship to someone who reminds me of that kind of quiet strength. Her father was a mechanic lost at sea 2 years ago. She paints, loves ships, wants to be an engineer." The girl stood eyes wide. The applause was not thunderous, but it was real. As I stepped off the stage, a man I didn't recognize stopped me. His grandson clung to his leg. The boy wore a cadet pin crooked on his chest and a faded name tag, Hayes T. "Not related," the man said quickly, almost apologetic. But when he saw the flyer, he said, "Maybe I could be one too." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. Sometimes silence fits better than any script. Later, as I passed the pie table, a girl tugged at my sleeve. The scholarship winner. She handed me a folded piece of construction paper. "I drew this," she whispered. It was a crayon sketch, me standing at a podium, stick figure flags behind me, the tie a bright stripe of silver. "My dad says you brought his name back." I swallowed. When I got home, I opened the box, the one that used to hold the tie. I placed the drawing inside next to the photo, next to the letter with no signature. I closed the lid softly, then sat in the quiet for a long moment. "Legacy," I murmured, "not to anyone in particular isn't what they give you. It's what you build." Outside, the tide was coming in. The frame now rests by the window, catching late afternoon light like it belongs there. The silver tie lies flat, no longer needing to prove anything, not to a pew, not to a podium. I used to think legacy was about names etched on brass. Turns out it's more about how quietly something endures after being mended. Sometimes we don't rebuild to impress. We rebuild to remember and maybe forgive. So if you're holding on to something torn, be it fabric or memory, ask yourself, what would it mean to make it whole again? Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to subscribe and share your thoughts.